Matthew always felt like his life had started with a hole in his chest. At home, the basics that can't be bought, care, guidance, a comforting hug, were missing. His parents' addiction filled every space, like a noise that never turned off. As a kid, he tried to figure out the day's mood by watching his mother's hands, his father's eyes. He wanted to get it right, he wanted to be seen. He grew up learning to expect little, and swallow a lot. At school, he carried a simple snack and a shy smile. There were days he came home with a notebook full of work and an empty stomach. A neighbor, Donna Ruth, sometimes called him inside and pushed a bowl of cereal toward him. "You're strong, kid," she'd say. He'd believe it for a few minutes, until he heard an argument through the thin wall of his room. That's when the strength would vanish, and silence would take over again. In his teens, an older classmate offered him his first escape. He said it helped shut off your mind. Matthew went for it. Relief came fast, along with the illusion that he'd found a way out. But each day, the price went up. His body demanded more, his mind demanded more. He found himself trading responsibilities for excuses, dreams for emergencies. Still, he held on to a thread of hope, the idea that if he got a job, maybe he could rewrite his own story. He landed a job early, sweeping floors and stacking boxes at a grocery store. He liked showing up before his shift and leaving with sore hands. It gave him a sense of accomplishment his home never had. For a short while, life seemed to have a rhythm. But the environment stayed polluted with easy promises and dangerous shortcuts. Well-connected friends flashed fast money, new sneakers, shiny phones. Temptation whispered that grinding day after day was foolish, and that shorter paths existed. But what Matthew didn't yet know was that behind every shortcut lay a trap, and the next choice he made could decide whether he'd stay lost or finally find the way out he'd been searching for his whole life. You're watching Lessons from Life, a channel created especially to share guidance and real-life stories with lessons to learn. Since we're a new channel, we need your help. Hit like and subscribe to follow our upcoming stories. Bills piled up, and addiction started charging high interest. Matthew missed one shift, then another, until he lost his job. He decided to get into dealing to feed his habit. At first, he rationalized it: it's temporary. Temporary became routine. He started carrying a watchful gaze, always weighing who to trust and who posed a threat. He slept little and ate even worse. He stayed alert on the outside but felt hollow inside, like a flickering light. One night, he saved up coins to buy a simple cake for his mom's birthday. On the way, he traded the cake for another hit. When he realized what he'd done, he sat on the sidewalk holding the empty box. That hurt more than any scolding ever had. It was a point of no return. He understood his addiction was steering his actions, making choices for him. Still, he kept going. He didn't know how to jump off a moving train. The fall came when a partner tried to cut his losses by turning someone in. The raid hit without warning. They took Matthew, along with whatever they found in his pockets and closet. At the police station, he avoided making excuses. He felt like anything he said would come out twisted. The cell was small, but reality was too big to fit inside it. The first night stretched long, packed with memories that gave him no rest. He remembered the boy who drew rockets on bread wrappers and felt ashamed of the man he'd become. The following days settled into a pattern: wake up early, straighten your space, wait for roll call, try to stay unnoticed. Matthew preferred to stay quiet. He watched the guys who fought over nothing, those who laughed loudly to hide their pain, and those lost in the same old stories. Occasionally, he'd get a note from Donna Ruth asking if he needed anything. He'd reply with thanks and an apology for not visiting sooner. It was his way of reminding himself there was someone out there who'd once called him strong. One ordinary afternoon, a missionary walked down the corridor, speaking softly to anyone willing to listen. He didn't preach or demand promises. He just leaned a book against the bars and said, "If it helps, it's yours." The cover was worn, the title spoke of recovery, of a possible fresh start. Matthew took it without much expectation. He gave a brief nod of thanks and tucked it away. The book stayed under his mattress for 2 days. He was afraid of what those pages might stir up inside him. On the 3rd day, after a shouting match in the yard, his mind started spinning, and he reached for anything that could ground him. He pulled the book from its hiding spot and rested it on his knee. He opened it at random. The first line talked about loss and responsibility, about choices that seem unavoidable, until someone shows you another way. His heart raced. A memory surfaced, him as a kid, eating cereal at Donna Ruth's, and, for the first time in a long while, Matthew wanted to understand how life had slipped through his fingers. Between the cold bars and the weight of guilt, Matthew held that book like it was his last thread. He didn't know it yet, but he was facing the chance that could turn his whole story upside down. He turned the page slowly. Read the 2nd line, then the 3rd. He didn't look for shortcuts or argue with the words. He just kept going. And as the words sank in, he felt an uneasy, yet freeing, sensation, that this book understood him better than he'd ever admitted to himself. Night fell without warning. Matthew stayed right there, book open, a question pulsing in his mind. What if there really was a crack where light could get through? Matthew carried with him the memory of having hit rock bottom. Prison felt like the last step on a broken ladder. Days dragged by, each one the same as the last, until one detail changed everything, that book the missionary had left behind. He started reading without expecting anything, but the words seemed to speak directly to him. Each page felt like a punch, reminding him of everything he'd lost, his childhood, respect, his dreams. It was as if he were standing in front of a mirror, staring at a man he barely recognized. He didn't sleep the first night he read. He stayed up late, turning pages, remembering the child he once was, the promise he'd made never to follow in his parents' footsteps, and how everything had slipped away. With every line, a mix of shame and hope rose inside him. For the first time, he believed he could fight back. And he made a silent pact: if he got another chance, he wouldn't waste it. Freedom came with a different kind of weight. Outside prison walls, he ran into invisible barriers. He applied for jobs and landed interviews, but as soon as they found out about his past, everything fell apart. He heard curt remarks and saw judgmental looks before he'd even had a chance to try. He managed to get hired at a mechanic shop, but once the truth came out, they quickly invented excuses to let him go. It was as if society had already decided he was condemned forever. Still, Matthew kept pushing. He'd rather live alone in a rented room than go back home and fall into the cycle of drugs again. Every morning, he woke up with the same goal: to resist. And it was in that fragile moment that a neighbor, noticing his quiet struggle, stepped in to help. He got Matthew a simple job as a barista at a coffee shop. It was modest work, but it meant a lot. It was an open door after so many had slammed shut. And it was behind that counter, serving coffee, that Matthew realized the pact he'd made in prison might actually come to life. He didn't know it yet, but the transformation beginning there would be far greater than anything he could have imagined. Behind the coffee shop counter, Matthew experienced something new, a sense of belonging. It wasn't just about serving coffee or clearing tables, it was about being in a place where, for a few hours a day, he felt part of the world again. His co-workers were friendly but kept a respectful distance, giving him space without prying. For him, that was enough. Every paycheck he received was more than money, it was proof he could still rebuild the pieces of his life that addiction had shattered. It was just an ordinary coffee shop, but behind that counter, hidden among simple orders, lay the chance for a turning point that would change everything. Amid the routine, one day changed everything. The coffee shop door opened, and Claire walked in. Young, kind, with a way of treating people that stood out. When she reached the counter, she ordered her coffee with a smile that seemed to light up the room. But what struck Matthew most was her gaze. There was no judgment, no uncomfortable curiosity he so often noticed in others. She simply treated him like any other person, worthy of respect. That moved him deeply. Their encounters became regular. Claire started visiting the shop more often, always exchanging a few quick words. Sometimes she talked about books, sometimes about music, other times she just asked how he was doing. Matthew kept his answers simple, but inside, each conversation left a mark. Their friendship grew slowly, like a quiet flame that kept burning even on windy days. He never felt comfortable enough to reveal his whole past. He carried the fear that once Claire learned about his time in prison, she'd pull away like so many others had. But her steady kindness gradually chipped away at that wall. One day, when the weight felt unbearable, he shared part of the truth. He told her he'd made bad choices, that he'd lost his way. He braced himself for disappointment in her eyes, but that's not what he saw. Claire simply replied, "Mistakes don't define who you are. What matters is what you do after." Those words became a turning point. For the first time, Matthew believed he could be seen for more than his mistakes. And that gave him fuel to keep going. Their friendship soon took on a new tone. He found himself eagerly waiting for the days she'd show up, feeling lighter whenever they talked. Claire, too, began opening up, showing she'd found in him someone she could trust. The change wasn't magical, but it ran deep. The man who once avoided eye contact now held full conversations. The insecure employee started working harder because someone now believed in his effort. Matthew discovered that trust is one of the greatest gifts a person can receive. And with Claire by his side, life seemed to be practicing a new melody, still fragile, but full of hope. What had started as a simple customer interaction at a coffee shop was no longer just routine. It was the beginning of something he never could have predicted, a chance to rewrite his story with the support of someone who saw more in him than his past could show. What began as friendship slowly turned into commitment. Claire offered her shoulder when Matthew decided to face his past head-on. He joined support groups, sorted out his paperwork, and paid off small debts he'd been dragging around for years. At the coffee shop, his manager noticed his dedication and promoted him to supervisor. With his new salary, he rented a better place and finally gathered the courage to call his mother. Her voice trembled. He told her he was changing, and that he dreamed of both of them living free from addiction. He hung up with his heart racing, but steady. That call to his mother was a milestone. But what Matthew didn't yet know was that this fresh start was only the beginning of an even more surprising journey, one where love and redemption would walk side by side. The months that followed brought quiet upheavals. Matthew started studying at night, short courses in customer service, basic management, personal finance. Claire encouraged every step, showing up with notebooks and a new pen for each small victory. He learned to manage his money, built an emergency fund, and paid off old debts. Discipline brought dignity. And dignity, in turn, opened doors. The manager, nearing retirement, recommended Matthew to coordinate the morning shift. It was symbolic. The same hands that once carried drugs now signed other people's work schedules. With his life in order, Matthew did what he'd promised himself. He got his parents into a rehab clinic. It was hard to convince them, especially his father, who distrusted everything. Claire joined the conversations, listened to their complaints, held space for the guilt that surfaced, and kept things steady when emotions ran high. The day they finally agreed to go in, Matthew took a deep breath and hugged his mother longer than he could remember ever doing. They left exhausted, but with a new kind of relief, the kind you feel when you finally set down a heavy suitcase you've carried your whole life. Their relationship blossomed. Matthew proposed to Claire in a simple way, with a ring tucked into a small box he'd wrapped himself. She smiled, touched, and said that getting married there meant more than a party, it meant continuing a shared purpose. The ceremony gathered only a few close friends. Donna Ruth, the neighbor who'd fed him cereal as a child, sat in the front row. Matthew thanked her with a kiss on the forehead and quietly promised, I'll give back to the world everything I received without deserving it." After a short honeymoon, he returned to the counter, now with even more light in his eyes. Claire took on a voluntary administrative role, helping standardize processes, reduce waste, and improve customer service. The coffee shop thrived, and the owner offered them a partnership. With a solid foundation, Matthew began giving talks to young people in recovery. He spoke plainly, without embellishment, about how drugs seemed like a solution but only multiplied pain, about how shame can paralyze you, about how someone believing in you can be the key that turns everything around. At every talk, he told the same story: meeting Claire was my miracle, like watching water turn into wine. The audience would listen with tears in their eyes. Some approached him afterward, asking for advice, hugs, or just a word of courage. He'd leave those meetings tired, but renewed. It was at one of these talks that the unexpected happened. At the end, an older man with gray hair waited for the line to clear. He stepped forward quietly and handed Matthew a book with a worn cover, the same title he'd read in prison. Matthew's heart leapt. The man spoke softly, "I've been visiting prisons for years. I left a copy with you. Remember?" Matthew opened his mouth but couldn't find words. The man went on, "Back then, a volunteer sorted the books and wrote personal notes for some inmates. She asked me to deliver a certain package that week. Said she felt that book needed to find one specific person." Matthew turned the book in his hands, and for the first time, noticed something he'd never seen before. On the back cover, faint but clear, was a handwritten line: "If you've made it this far, I believe in you. See." His legs nearly gave out. He looked up, confused. The man smiled, proud and calm, and said, "C for Claire. My daughter." The silence that followed seemed to hold the air still. Memories rushed through Matthew's mind: prison, the afternoon he first opened the book, his first conversation with Claire at the coffee shop, the faith she placed in him when no one else would. Everything clicked into place like puzzle pieces that had waited years to fit together. He tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. The man added gently, "She started volunteering very young, then moved on with her life. By the time you met her, she'd stopped visiting prisons, but she still believed every book planted a seed." Matthew walked out of that auditorium feeling like he'd crossed an invisible bridge. The miracle he'd been telling people about had just revealed a deeper layer. It wasn't just that he'd met Claire by chance. Years earlier, her hand had already reached the man he was behind bars. Their meeting at the coffee shop was no longer coincidence, it was purpose. He told Claire that same night. He showed her the back cover, the "C" that had survived time. She covered her face in surprise, and the two of them laughed and cried in the same breath. The past, once full of loose ends, suddenly formed a clear picture. Matthew finally understood, in the clearest possible way, the phrase he'd repeated from the start: water into wine. The liquid was the same, but the essence had been transformed. So had the man. From then on, their story took on a new mission. They launched a program within the coffee shop to hire people starting over, offering training, financial mentoring, and, above all, trust. The bulletin board displayed photos of those who turned their lives around. Beneath each picture, a single line: "Someone believed." At the end of his talks, Matthew began sharing this final revelation, not for drama, but to show that miracles are also built from simple choices: a donated book, a handwritten note, a cup of coffee served with respect, an "I believe in you" spoken at just the right moment. People left not just with a story, they left with a key. And the life lesson, now etched like a promise, stood clear: your past explains your pain, but it doesn't dictate your destiny. Sometimes, all that separates a fall from a turnaround is one person who insists on seeing who you can become, and when that happens, everything changes. Like water, quietly, turning into wine. Our channel was created to share powerful stories of recovery. We're still at the beginning of this journey, and we need your support to grow. So please, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and help spread these messages of hope.